So Isaiah 5 begins as a love song, but not a song of rapturous affection, but a ballad of heartbreak. You see, Isaiah imagines God as a devoted gardener, as we heard, bending low to plant a vineyard on fertile ground, clearing away the stones, choosing only the best vines, building a watchtower for protection, carving a winepress into the rock. It's a picture of extravagance, of extravagant hope. Everything has been prepared for abundance. Everything's been prepared for sweetness and for life. But when the season came, rotten grapes. God expected justice, but found bloodshed. God expected righteousness, but heard only the cries of the oppressed. A nation that was given every gift, but chose greed, exploitation, and violence instead. Just as we saw on our civil rights pilgrimage last week. A vineyard that bore the fruit of cruelty. So nearly 20 members of Mission Hills traveled with nearly 20 members of Pilgrim UCC in Carlsbad, and we arrived in Atlanta on Monday, September 22nd. And the next morning we made our first stop in Anniston, Alabama, infamous for its brutality against the Freedom Riders. So in the spring of 1961, the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, put out a call for people willing to challenge the South's defiance of a Supreme Court ruling that ended segregation on interstate buses and terminals. They were organizing a bus ride from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans. But they didn't just ask who wants to go. They asked, who is willing to die? Riding through the Deep South, black and white, side by side, was like striking a match in a room full of gasoline. And so first there was the application. Why do you want to go? Have you told your family what may happen to you? And then an extensive interview, including, could you take a blow without giving one in return? And then the training. In church basements, they practiced again and again being dragged from their chairs, hair pulled, shoved to the ground until their bodies had the muscle memory to go limp. And their lips whispering prayers instead of curses. Because one clenched fist, one angry shove could undo everything. And not everyone made it through. But at last 13 were chosen, 7 black, 6 white, including a retired professor, a minister, a veteran, and a 19-year-old nursing student named Mae Frances Moultrie. She boarded the bus that left Washington, D.C., and when it rolled into Anniston, Alabama on Mother's Day, she sat in the middle as the windows shattered under the mob's attack at a small Greyhound station. That was our first stop on our first week. And so here's what happened. 100 men, organized by the Klan, were tipped off by the police, who promised to give them 15 minutes to do what they wanted before authorities showed up. And so they smashed windows, they slashed tires, they cursed and threatened. And inside the bus, Mae Frances and others sat frozen, praying. And somehow the driver managed to inch the crippled bus out of the station, limping down the highway on flat tires. And 6 miles out of town, we saw the second sight. It was the place where the bus stopped and the mob surrounded it, shouting and pounding on all sides, and then came the bottle of gasoline lit and hurled through a broken window that exploded inside. Flames tore down the aisle, and as the riders gasped for breath, they clawed at the doors and tried to escape. But the mob held the doors shut from the outside, because their plan was not just to frighten, but to burn them alive in the heart of Alabama. And then, by what some call a miracle, the heat reached the fuel tank and a thunderous crack blew it open, forcing the mob to scatter just long enough for the riders to crawl free. And they staggered into the daylight, choking, coughing, their bodies blistered and blackened by smoke, only to be beaten again by fists, bats, chains, and iron pipes. May Frances was beaten senselessly by grown men who hated the sight of her courage. We stood on that roadside where the charred skeleton of the bus once lay and remembered by photographs that went around the world. The Greyhound engulfed in smoke and flame, the black sky above it, riders barely escaping with their lives. This image burning itself into America's conscience in 1961. The ride began with 13, and that might have been the end. But students from Nashville, including Diane Nash and John Lewis, refused to let the ride die, and so 13 became 30, and then 100, and then 200, and by the end of that summer, there were 430 freedom riders who had answered the call from the South and the North, from colleges and churches and union halls. And that original plan was one bus to New Orleans, but the Spirit had a different plan, a bigger one. It ended up there were hundreds of buses, hundreds of riders, some barely 18, others in their 60s. And they filled Mississippi's jails until there was no room left because they refused bail. And they sang freedom songs through prison bars and bore witness rather than bow to fear. 430 in wave after wave, risking their bodies so that God's vineyard might bear good fruit. That was just the first morning of our pilgrimage. We got on the bus and went to Birmingham, where we visited the 16th Street Baptist Church, where 4 little girls were killed. Denise McNair was the youngest of them, only 11 years old. She loved to gather neighborhood children together to play school, always casting herself as the teacher. And on that September Sunday morning in 1963, just a month after the March on Washington, she and her friends were in the ladies' lounge of the church basement, preparing to usher on Youth Sunday. And a few minutes later, at least 15 sticks of dynamite were set off outside steps, which stole their future. And then we walked across the street to the park, where children once faced fire hoses turned up so high it was meant to tear the skin from their bodies. And our guide, Wilhelmina, led us through streets and pointed out how one side was white and the other black. And in her stories, we heard the resilience of the people. But you do realize if Christian nationalists succeed, school children will never learn that their peers once stood against hoses and dogs for the sake of justice, because it might make them uncomfortable. Because without that truth, their conscience will not be stirred if and when it happens to other children. The next morning, we drove to Selma and were guided by Barbara Barge, who is an outspoken retired school teacher who had been one of the young foot soldiers, very young foot soldiers, who remembered being kissed on the cheek by Dr. King and vowing never to wash her face. We saw beautiful murals and historic sites, but then she took us to a Confederate cemetery, a place that made me feel nauseous with its monuments surrounded by Confederate flags, new, fresh Confederate flags around the cemetery. And she took us there because she said, "You must see this too, because we have to live with it every day." That made it real. And then came the sacred journey many of us had been waiting for. We walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, imagining the first glimpse of the mob that waited on the other side. and it was both a sobering and inspiring experience. Afterward, we drove the 50 miles to Montgomery, along the same road that the marchers once traveled, who slept on rain-soaked ground for 5 days. To erase this story from the history books is another act itself of violence. And then that morning in Montgomery, we boarded a boat for the Equal Justice Initiative's new sculpture garden. And we floated up the beautiful, calm, picturesque Alabama River, which made it all the more haunting to remember that this river once carried thousands of enslaved people to the auction block on Court Square in staggering numbers. In 1820, there were 45,000 enslaved people in Alabama. In 1860, the number had grown to 435,000. And we asked each other, did we hear that right? And when our boat docked, we entered a garden of sculptures envisioned by Brian Stevenson that was so powerful it took nearly 90 minutes to walk its paths, for some people even longer. And near the end is the National Monument to Freedom. It's a 43-foot wall tall, inscribed with 122,000 surnames drawn from the 1870 census. These are the names that were taken by those who had survived enslavement. Every name representing a family, a story, a seed of hope that refused to be erased. And a quote in the sculpture garden reads, "The most radical form of resistance to enslavement was survival and never giving away the capacity to love." And then the Legacy Museum. Massive. I saw it 5 years ago, and it was a quarter of the size. And it tells the story in a straight, unflinching line, beginning when you walk in to the sound and images of the ocean waves crashing over your head, pulling you into the terror of the Middle Passage. And then it leads you past slave pens and auction blocks where men, women, and children cry out to be seen. And the exhibits unfold showing how emancipation was followed not by freedom, but by convict leasing and chain gangs and a new form of terror called sharecropping. The same logic with different chains. They showed how lynching became the weapon of terror to keep black people in their place, and they showed how segregation then walled off schools and buses and neighborhoods, and then they show how today's prisons carry forward the same logic. And not confined to Alabama, mind you. California has nothing to be proud of. African Americans are 5.4% of the population in California. Got that? 5.4%. What is the prison population of African Americans in California? Anybody want to guess? Fortunately, not that. 28%. Bad, not good. Yeah. But the message is unflinching from the museum that slavery did not end. It evolved. And it keeps evolving, repeating itself in new forms. And at the Confederate Cemetery, we read a plaque proudly quoting Jefferson Davis, "The principles for which we contend will reassert themselves in another time and another form." Prophetic words. That is Isaiah's vineyard gone to waste. Rotten grapes that bore only cruelty. And then we visited the beautifully haunting memorial to the thousands of victims of racial terror. And we walked beneath more than 800 steel columns, each one suspended like a body, each one inscribed with the name of a county and all the names of those lynched there. And one of them, remembered, was Arthur St. Clair. He was once enslaved in Florida, but after freedom, he became a Baptist minister and a county commissioner. And in a sign of how far Reconstruction dared to go lifting up black leadership, he rose to become the captain of what we would now call the National Guard. But in 1877, he was lynched for performing a wedding of David James and Lizzie Day, a black man and a white woman, knowing the danger but refusing to deny their love. And later, as he traveled home, a mob of armed white men surrounded him on a country road where they left his body as a warning, but his courage still speaks. A minister who risked everything to show that God's love is greater than man's hate. That's a vineyard meant to bear the fruit of justice. So Brian Stevenson is a genius, and EJI have created one of the finest museums ever conceived, complete with this memorial and sculpture garden. And like the Holocaust Museum, which was an inspiration, it is also one of the hardest places you will ever encounter. And it confronts the heart and the mind, demanding attention. And you could spend days within its walls and still carry the work of processing it for a lifetime. If you can go. On Friday morning, we visited the parsonage where 24-year-old Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta first began their ministry. A modest home, what took many of us, especially touched many of us, where it was full of furnishings we recognized from our own childhoods, which made him feel less like a monument and more like a young pastor and husband. And yet this ordinary home became the hub of the civil rights movement and was scarred by the blast of a bomb on the porch that blew out living room windows but could not extinguish its light. And then our last stop in Montgomery, which is for those who were there, I took this on another trip. We weren't allowed to take pictures on this one, and I didn't sneak upstairs. This in Montgomery is Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, where King served as the pastor from 1954 to 1960, in his 20s. And when we sat in this light-filled sanctuary, we could imagine the many sermons he gave from the pulpit up front. For example, his sermon, Loving Your Enemies, that he gave in 1957. And he said, loving your enemies. Far from being the pious injunction of a utopian dreamer, this command is an absolute necessity for the survival of our civilization. Yes, it is love that will save our world, love even for our enemies. And when the opportunity presents itself for you to defeat your enemy, that is the time which you must not do it. On our way to Atlanta, we stopped in Tuskegee and learned the story of how for 40 years, hundreds of black men in Macon County were told they were being treated for bad blood, but they were really being studied as their syphilis went untreated, even after penicillin had been discovered as the treatment. One of them, Herman Shaw, lived long enough to stand at the White House in 1997 when President Clinton offered an apology. And Shaw said, "We were all hardworking men and citizens of the United States." That word, citizens, kind of rings like an alarm bell. Now, are you feeling heavy? How do you think our group felt at this point in our pilgrimage? You can imagine the heaviness on our soul. Wouldn't have done it differently. Just know going in. Wow. But Saturday morning, we walked through the sunlit streets of Sweet Auburn. It's the neighborhood Dr. King was raised in as a boy, and our guide, Roger, spoke with pride, pointing out the churches and the shops, the businesses that made what this once the most prosperous black neighborhood in the country. pride and grief. When, for example, Roger showed us the scar that tore through the heart of the community, the freeway that cut right through the middle. Anybody think that was a mistake? By accident? And that afternoon, our group came together and began this lively conversation, speaking aloud what we might do with our experiences. And then that night, after so much sorrow, we went to a club and we danced. Resistance requires such joy, not to erase what we had witnessed, but to breathe for a moment and to hold one another in laughter and song. And it was Rob's 80th birthday, and Al and Rob danced a slow dance in the middle of this club in front of us all. It was so beautiful. It was all a release for our weary spirits. And then on Sunday morning, we went to worship at Ebenezer Baptist Church, Dr. King's home congregation, now in a new sanctuary. And we watched as 4 people stepped into the waters of baptism. We sang until even my own body swayed a little. And we listened as Reverend Dr. Olivia Maxwell declared, "Truth must make noise." And it was the clearest call we could have carried home from this pilgrimage. History must not be silenced. Now, I cautioned our travelers at the very beginning that this journey will break your heart. But it will break your heart open. It will stir grief, and it will stir courage. And it will call us to not only see what was, but what still is, and what can be. Because the same Spirit that moved then is moving still. Just got to get on board. So back to Isaiah. It describes this picture of extravagant hope. God who has prepared everything for abundance, for sweetness, and for life. And so I say, let us tend the vineyard of justice. Let us tend the vines of righteousness. Let us become the fruit of God's extravagant hope. And know this, that embodying God's hope in these days of rising hate, shrinking courage, and muffled conscience requires this daring conviction. Truth must make noise. We must make